Are you envious because I'm generous? The landowner asks a very important question, one that we too must answer. Do I feel envious of others? Are we working for God's kingdom or for ourselves? For riches? For power? For fame? No matter when we say yes to working for God's kingdom, even if it's on our deathbed, we can go to heaven like the one who lived his whole life working for God's kingdom, because God is generous to perfection. I found it interesting that the landowner told his foreman to pay the last first. I think the earlier laborers who had worked all day would have been unaware that the ones who worked so little in the time in the fields were paid the same wage if they had been paid and then left before the last ones that were hired were paid. I know that's a mouthful, but I wonder, do we look at our earnings that way? Well, of course we do. I think that's what this parable speaks to. Our human nature is to compare what we have or earn in relation to others. It's just our nature. And Jesus is relying on that nature when he tells this parable to illustrate what is important and what is God's nature. To love us each equally and therefore reward us equally no matter how long we've worked for him. Our God, who is generous and forgiving, has only our best welfare in his heart, and he's generous to perfection. He doesn't distinguish between the haves and the have-nots. He instead looks at their hearts. So again, we must ask ourselves, what is my heart lacking? If we make the effort to discern what we are lacking in our own hearts, we can take the necessary steps to correct our faults so that we're not lacking when we finally come face to face with God. The readings from last Sunday challenged us to imitate our Heavenly Father by forgiving others as he forgives us. And today's readings continue that theme in a similar way. They challenge us not to resent God's generosity, but strive rather to reflect his generosity in our relations with one another. In our first reading from the prophet Isaiah, it reminds us that God does not think the way we think, nor act the way we act. When we look at the parable, we see that the landowner, and right here you'd think God, is not an ordinary landowner just in it for the profit, but that he really does care for the workers' welfares. And the vineyard is God's kingdom. And the laborers, well, that's us. He personally oversees the hiring of the workers, which is very unusual in that time. Normally, he would send his foreman out to get more workers, not himself personally. And it might surprise you to recognize that when he hires them, when, as Jews, they are supposed to gather and pray first thing in the morning, at 9 o'clock, at noon, at 3, and again at 5. Now, think now of that importance of those times. At noon, when Jesus was hung on the cross. At 3, when he died. And at 5, when Pilate gave permission to him for him to be pulled down and buried. So this parable is extremely prophetic because it is not just a story about hiring laborers and paying them all the same. No, it's about God preparing his kingdom, the vineyard, which will be the new world. Looking at it from another angle, it's about God's enormous heart, his extravagant generosity to those we sometimes choose not to see, especially the latecomers, those overlooked or left behind, Or those, how about those under the overpasses of our freeways in tent cities that popped up? Or maybe just those who have been pushed to the margins of society. God's way, while not going against the demands of social justice, infinitely transcends that. Pope Benedict taught in his encyclical letter, Caritas in Veritate, that God acts according to a higher logic than that which usually governs business relations, the logic or gift of gratuitous love rather than the logic of entitlement. If only we look at this logic of God's gratuitous love, can we understand the foolish generosity of the vineyard owner, or the extravagant welcome of the father in the parable of the prodigal son. Only by this logic can we appreciate the extraordinary behavior of Jesus in mixing with the tax collectors and sinners, providing us with the perfect example for how we should live our lives. I found this reflection from a Father, Flora McCarthy, and I thought it was fitting to end with this. My thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. How small our thoughts can be, and how poor our ways of seeing and judging. We think miserly thoughts and act in miserly ways. Why? Because we have small minds and small hearts. So, Lord, open our minds and enlarge our hearts so that we may think more like you. Let us not begrudge your goodness to others, knowing that we too are undeserving of your favors and stand more in need of your mercy than of your justice.